Everyone thinks they know the Bowie knife, the blade that defined the American frontier. A weapon born in blood, carried by heroes, and swung by legends. But the truth is, almost everything you've heard about this knife is wrong. Hollywood made it a symbol of survival. Folklore turned it into a superweapon. And for nearly 2 centuries, the name Bowie has been sharper than the steel itself. But the real story of the Bowie knife is stranger, murkier, and far less romantic than the legend it became. Was it really designed by Jim Bowie himself? Did he actually forge it from a fallen meteorite? And did he really die slashing attackers with his knife at the Alamo, like the movies claim? We're counting down the 13 biggest myths about the Bowie knife, ranked from tall tales and exaggerations to the single biggest lie that shaped the legend of America's most famous blade. And make sure you stick around until the very end, because myth number 1 changes everything you think you know about the Bowie knife, the man behind it, and the myths that built the Wild West itself. Once you hear the truth, you'll never look at the Bowie knife or the frontier the same way again. So let's see how many of these you've believed, starting with one of the bloodiest and most dramatic stories ever told, the myth of Jim Bowie's final stand at the Alamo. Number 13. Jim Bowie died slashing attackers at the Alamo. If you've ever seen a movie about the Alamo, you've probably watched Jim Bowie, feverish, bloodied, gripping his knife, rise from his cot and fight to the last breath. The scene is iconic. The dying hero, surrounded by smoke and bayonets, cutting down enemies in a blaze of glory. But the truth? That moment never happened. By the time the final assault began on March 6, 1836, Jim Bowie was gravely ill, most likely bedridden with typhoid or pneumonia. Eyewitness accounts say he was too weak to stand, let alone swing a knife. When Mexican troops overran the Alamo's hospital, Bowie was likely shot or bayoneted where he lay. His famous knife may not have even been in the room. The legend of the last stand came later, first whispered by survivors, then expanded by newspapers and dime novelists who wanted a martyr, not a man. Hollywood picked up the story and turned it into a cinematic fantasy. Slow motion, flashing steel, the hero refusing to die quietly. It's powerful imagery, but it's not history. The real Jim Bowie didn't die fighting with his knife. He died because of the legend that surrounded it, a reputation for ferocity that made him a target long before the battle began. The Bowie knife didn't win the Alamo. It became the symbol of a myth Americans still believe. And that's just the beginning, because coming up at number 12, we're tackling another legend that's just as dramatic. The idea that Jim Bowie himself was a trained, deadly knife fighter. Number 12, Jim Bowie was a master knife fighter or duelist. If you've heard the name Jim Bowie, you've probably imagined a man who could outfight anyone with a blade in his hand, a professional duelist who perfected the art of the knife. It's an image that's lasted nearly 2 centuries. The fearless frontiersman standing cool and steady, blade flashing in the sun, cutting down challengers one by one. Movies, novels, even history books have painted him that way, the South's deadliest knife fighter. But that reputation came almost entirely from one chaotic event, the Sandbar Fight of 1827. What began as a formal pistol duel between 2 other men erupted into a bloody melee when tempers flared among their supporters. Bowie wasn't one of the duelists. He was a bystander. In the confusion, he was shot, stabbed, clubbed, and somehow he survived. The fight became frontier legend. Newspapers exaggerated it, storytellers rewrote it, and within weeks, Jim Bowie was being described as a man who could kill with a single stroke. Bladesmiths started selling oversized hunting knives under his name, and the myth of Bowie the Duelist took on a life of its own. In reality, Bowie had no record of formal training and no history of organized knife duels. He was brave, certainly, reckless even, but his fame came from surviving a brawl, not mastering a craft. The sandbar made him a legend because he lived through it, not because he won it. That single event turned an ordinary man into the symbol of American knife fighting. And while Hollywood later sharpened his legend to perfection, the real Jim Bowie was just a survivor in the wrong place at the right time. Also, if you're into myth-busting the real West, tap that like button so more history fans find this. And speaking of design myths that refuse to die, that brings us to number 11, the belief that there was ever such a thing as one true Bowie knife. Number 11. Every cowboy and frontiersman carried a Bowie knife. When people picture the American frontier, they imagine every cowboy, outlaw, and frontiersman with a Bowie knife hanging from his belt, the essential blade of the Wild West. Hollywood made it look universal, campfire flames flickering on polished steel, every man armed with the same heavy frontier knife. But that image is more fantasy than fact. By the time the West was truly settled, the Bowie knife had already passed its prime. It was a symbol, not a staple. In the early 1800s, it was popular along the Mississippi River, where the legend began. But out on the plains and cattle trails, it was far less common. Most working cowboys weren't duelists or hunters. They were laborers. They needed small, practical knives for cutting rope, food, or leather, not foot-long blades meant for combat. Many couldn't afford a finely made Bowie anyway, and the big knives that did show up on the trail were often cheap imitations or hand-me-downs from the Civil War. Surviving records from ranches and supply stores tell the real story. Folding pocket knives were sold in bulk, while large Bowies were rare. Even buffalo hunters and scouts often favored smaller sheath knives that were easier to carry and maintain. So how did the myth start? Partly through 19th century nostalgia, traveling shows, and dime novels that romanticized the frontier as a land of heroes with gleaming Bowies on their hips. Then came Hollywood, which cemented the image in every Western movie made after the 1930s. The truth is, most frontiersmen didn't carry Bowie knives. They carried whatever blade they could afford, and most were small, simple, and worn from use. The Bowie became the symbol of the cowboy, not the tool. Coming up at number 10, we'll dig into the blade itself and reveal whether Jim Bowie actually created the knife that bears his name. Number 10, Jim Bowie invented the Bowie knife himself. Ask anyone who's heard of the Bowie knife who created it, and most will give the same answer. Jim Bowie made it himself. In books, movies, and museum labels, he's shown hammering out the first blade at a frontier forge, shaping the weapon that would carry his name. It's a great story, the perfect blend of hero, craftsmanship, and myth. But the real history is far less clear. By the time Jim Bowie's name became famous, several knives already claimed to be the original Bowie. Some historians credit his brother Resin Bowie, who said he'd commissioned the first version for Jim years before the sandbar fight. Others point to James Black, a bladesmith from Arkansas who allegedly refined that design into the curved, guard-heavy shape we recognize today. The truth is, no one knows exactly who forged the first Bowie knife, and that mystery became part of its power. What we do know is that Bowie didn't patent it, record its design, or even describe it in writing. The knife that made him a legend spread through copies, each slightly different depending on who made it and where. Blacksmiths from Louisiana to Sheffield, England were soon turning out Bowie knives, and the name became bigger than the man himself. It wasn't one sudden creation, it was an evolution shaped by craftsmen, fighters, and marketers chasing a legend. The Bowie knife wasn't born from a single forge. It was forged by the stories that people wanted to believe. Your take. Whose version do you buy? Resin's commission or James Black's refinement? Comment Resin or Black. And speaking of stories people wanted to believe, the next one might be the wildest of them all, the claim that the first Bowie knife wasn't forged on Earth at all, but from a fallen meteorite. Number 9. The Bowie knife was made from a meteorite. Few stories about the Bowie knife sound as mysterious as this one, that Jim Bowie's legendary blade was forged from metal that fell from the sky. You'll still hear it repeated today, that a blacksmith used a piece of meteorite iron to make the first Bowie knife, giving it almost supernatural sharpness and strength. It's a great tale, half legend, half science fiction, and completely unsupported by history. No record, letter, or artifact from Bowie's lifetime mentions a meteorite blade. The rumor appeared decades later when newspapers and collectors started romanticizing the knife's origins. In reality, the blacksmiths of the early 1800s used simple carbon steel or wrought iron, the same materials used for farm tools and hunting knives. Working with meteorite iron wasn't just unlikely, it was nearly impossible without modern smelting equipment. The high nickel content made it brittle and unpredictable, far from the perfect steel storytellers imagined. So where did the myth come from? Probably from the knife's reputation. After the sandbar fight, people wanted a reason for Bowie's supposed invincibility, something that made his blade special. The idea that it came from a meteor fit perfectly into the frontier's obsession with divine signs and heaven-sent relics. By the late 19th century, collectors were even commissioning fake meteorite Bowies to sell to tourists and museums. The truth is, the Bowie knife wasn't born from the heavens. It was forged by human hands, shaped from ordinary steel and extraordinary storytelling. The real magic wasn't in the metal. It was in the myth. And that brings us to number 8, where we untangle another point of confusion, the belief that the Arkansas toothpick was just another name for the Bowie knife. Number 8, the Arkansas toothpick was just another name for a Bowie knife. If you've ever browsed an old weapons book or frontier museum, you've probably seen a long, narrow dagger labeled as an Arkansas toothpick, sometimes even displayed right beside a Bowie knife, as if they were the same weapon. Collectors and storytellers have blurred the two together for more than a century. But they were never the same thing. The Arkansas toothpick and the Bowie knife may have shared a birthplace and an era, but they were built for very different purposes. The Bowie knife was a heavy, single-edged fighting and utility blade, wide at the base with a clipped or curved point designed for both cutting and thrusting. The Arkansas toothpick, by contrast, was long, thin, and double-edged, closer to a dagger or small sword. It was meant purely for stabbing, not chopping or camp work. Period accounts and surviving examples make that distinction clear. Frontiersmen described Bowies as hunting knives or belt knives, while toothpicks were often mentioned in dueling circles or carried as gentlemen's sidearms in the South. Even 19th century knife makers marketed them differently, the Bowie as the frontier tool, the toothpick as the duelist's weapon. So why do people still confuse them? Because by the late 1800s, the Bowie name had become so famous that almost every large knife got labeled as one. Dealers, authors, and even museums found that calling something a Bowie sold more tickets and more copies. Over time, the lines blurred until the two became interchangeable in popular memory. The truth is, the Arkansas toothpick was the Bowie knife's sleeker cousin, similar in spirit but not in shape or purpose. Bowie versus Arkansas toothpick. Which design would you carry? Let me see who wins in the comments, Bowie or toothpick. And speaking of confusion, the next myth takes us deeper into the Wild West itself, where Hollywood claimed the Bowie knife was the main fighting weapon that tamed the frontier. Number 7. The Bowie knife was the West's main fighting weapon. Ask anyone to picture a fight in the Wild West, and chances are they'll imagine a man reaching for a Bowie knife, the gleaming blade flashing in the dust before the guns ever come out. Western movies made it look like every duel, ambush, and saloon fight started with that famous knife. But that image couldn't be further from reality. By the time the American West was actually being settled, the Bowie knife was already fading from daily use. It had seen its height decades earlier along the Mississippi River and in the southern states, not in frontier boomtowns like Dodge City or Tombstone. Out west, gun culture had taken over. Revolvers and rifles were the real tools of both defense and intimidation. That didn't mean the Bowie disappeared entirely. Some lawmen, gamblers, and drifters still carried one as a backup weapon or a symbol of toughness. But for most frontiersmen, knives were practical tools for cutting meat, rope, or hides, not their first line of defense. In actual fights, a pistol decided most outcomes long before blades were drawn. So why do we associate the Bowie knife so strongly with the Wild West? Hollywood again. Film crews needed visual drama, something that looked menacing on camera and tied the frontier to raw survival. The Bowie's size and shape fit the image perfectly, even if history didn't. In truth, the Bowie knife was a relic of an earlier age, a weapon of duels and riverboat brawls, not of cattle drives and mining camps. It symbolized the fighting spirit of the frontier long after the real frontier had moved on. And that leads us to number 6, where the myth shifts from cinematic to legal. The idea that Bowie knives were so deadly, they were banned across the frontier. Number 6, the Bowie knife was banned across the frontier for being too deadly. When people think of the Bowie knife, they often imagine it as so vicious, so feared, that it had to be outlawed across the West, a blade deemed too dangerous for civilized towns. Movies and folklore love that image, the giant knife flashing in the street, the sheriff stepping in to forbid it by law. But while there's a hint of truth to that story, the idea of a blanket frontier ban is pure exaggeration. Yes, some states and territories did try to restrict Bowie knives, but not because they were mythical superweapons. They were a legal headache. In the 1830s and 1840s, the Bowie became notorious in the South for duels, ambushes, and barroom murders. Legislators wanted to discourage concealed weapons, and the Bowie knife became the most visible target. Arkansas, Alabama, and Tennessee passed laws that taxed their sale or banned carrying them concealed. But open carry, owning one at home, perfectly legal almost everywhere. By the time settlers were pushing westward, those early Southern laws were already fading, and out on the frontier, no one cared what you strapped to your belt as long as you used it responsibly. Court records and newspapers from Texas to Kansas mention Bowies, but mostly as tools, not contraband. The legend of the banned Bowie grew later when sensational newspaper stories and pulp novels painted the knife as a moral danger, the weapon of gamblers, assassins, and outlaws. Hollywood picked that up and ran with it. On screen, the Bowie became the blade society feared, banned in every town, hidden under every coat. It was a perfect symbol of rebellion, not a reflection of law. The truth is, the Bowie knife was controversial, not illegal. A few states taxed it, a few discouraged it, but no government ever banned it outright. Its danger came from reputation, not regulation. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of viewer I make these for. Hit subscribe for more Wild West myths cut down to size. And speaking of danger and reputation, the next myth tackles how the Bowie's fame supposedly ended. The belief that the knife became obsolete the moment revolvers took over. Number 5. The Bowie knife became obsolete once revolvers appeared. When people talk about the rise of firearms in the Wild West, they often imagine the Bowie knife vanishing overnight, replaced by the revolver, the new king of close combat. It's an image that feels logical. Why carry a heavy blade when you could holster 6 shots of lead? But history tells a different story. The invention of the revolver didn't kill the Bowie knife, it simply changed how it was used. By the time Colt's revolvers became widely available in the 1850s, the Bowie had already evolved from a duelist's weapon into a frontier multi-purpose tool. It was used for skinning game, chopping wood, and even cooking. The kind of practical, everyday work a revolver couldn't handle. Soldiers and scouts still carried them well into the Civil War, often as backup weapons when ammunition ran out or close combat left no room for reloading. Confederate soldiers in particular prized them, forging crude battle bowies from file steel or wagon springs. Some were massive, nearly short sword length, meant for both utility and intimidation. The truth is, guns changed the way people fought, but they didn't replace knives entirely. Frontiersmen valued tools that worked when powder got wet or when stealth mattered more than sound. Even in the age of six-shooters, a bowie on your belt was still a symbol of readiness, a reminder that some fights ended closer than a gun could reach. The myth of total obsolescence came later, when Hollywood started framing the frontier as a technological race, from knives to guns to rifles to dynamite. It made for cleaner storytelling, but not accurate history. In reality, the Bowie knife never truly disappeared. It simply adapted from weapon to tool to icon. And that brings us to number 4, where Hollywood's imagination runs wild again, this time with the myth that Bowie knives were so fast and lethal, they might as well have been the revolvers of the blade world. Number 4. The Bowie knife was the West's fastest and most lethal weapon. Watch enough westerns, and you'll see it again and again. The Bowie knife drawn in a flash, a quick blur of steel, and the opponent dropping before a gun can even clear its holster. It's one of the most dramatic images in frontier mythology, the lightning-fast blade that could outmatch a bullet. But that kind of knife-speed showdown only ever existed in Hollywood. The real Bowie knife wasn't a duelist's quick-draw weapon. It was large, heavy, and slow to bring into action. Many early examples were over a foot long and weighed more than a pound. Deadly, yes, but not built for snap reflexes. You didn't flick a Bowie from your belt in a heartbeat. You committed to drawing it. That's why it was called a fighting knife, not a quick knife. Historical accounts from the frontier show that knife fights were rare, chaotic, and over in seconds, far from the choreographed duels we see on screen. The Bowie's real advantage wasn't speed, it was reach and intimidation. Just drawing one could stop a confrontation cold, because everyone knew what that blade could do at close range. The myth of superhuman knife speed grew later, when 20th century filmmakers and pulp writers wanted a symbol of raw, lethal precision. In movies, the knife always moved faster than the camera. No awkward fumbling, no hesitation, just instant cinematic death. It made the Bowie look like the revolver's equal in skill and danger. In truth, the Bowie knife was a weapon of presence, not reflex. It wasn't fast, it was final. And the men who carried it relied on its size and fearsome reputation, not on any miracle quick-draw technique. And speaking of miracle myths, the next one cuts even deeper. The claim that Bowie knives were banned across the frontier for being too deadly to trust in the hands of ordinary men. Number 3, the Bowie knife was purely a weapon of violence. In every movie and dime novel, the Bowie knife is shown as one thing: a killer's blade. It's the weapon that spills blood in every saloon fight, the tool of ambushes, revenge, and duels fought to the death. Over time, that image hardened until people believed the Bowie knife existed only for violence. But history paints a much broader picture. Yes, the Bowie began its life with blood on it. The sandbar fight made sure of that. Yet once the legend spread, the knife evolved far beyond the battlefield. Craftsmen turned it into a status symbol and a tool of pride. Wealthy planters, soldiers, and travelers commissioned ornate Bowies with silver fittings, carved handles, and personalized inscriptions. They were presented as gifts of honor, not weapons of murder. Frontiersmen carried them for survival, to skin game, split kindling, or cut rope on the trail. Soldiers used them for clearing brush, hunters for butchering meat. Letters from the period mention the Bowie as indispensable to camp life. Its edge was as practical as it was dangerous. The purely violent reputation grew later thanks to sensational newspaper stories and early 20th century films that needed a visual shorthand for danger. On screen, the Bowie became the outlaw's trademark, never the rancher's tool. It was easier for storytellers to show blood than craftsmanship. In truth, the Bowie knife was both, a weapon when it had to be, a tool when it didn't. It symbolized self-reliance as much as it did aggression. And while the movies made it a murderer's blade, the people who actually lived with one saw something far more balanced, a knife built for survival in a world that didn't forgive weakness. And that brings us to number 2, where myth and reality collide completely, the belief that modern Bowie knives are faithful copies of Jim Bowie's original design. Number 2, modern Bowie knives are faithful to Jim Bowie's original. If you've seen a Bowie knife in a movie, a shop window, or a collector's case, you probably think you're looking at the same kind of blade Jim Bowie carried. The long clip point, the brass guard, the heavy curved spine. It all looks so authentic that most people assume it's a faithful copy of the original. But the modern Bowie knife owes more to Hollywood than to history. The truth is, we don't actually know what Jim Bowie's own knife looked like. No verified example survives, and descriptions from his lifetime contradict one another. Some said it had a straight back, others a sweeping clip point. A few claimed it was huge, others described it as modest in size. Over time, blacksmiths, collectors, and filmmakers each added their own interpretation, until the classic Bowie shape became a blend of imagination and marketing. By the mid-20th century, movie studios had standardized the look. Prop masters wanted something that photographed well, broad blade, shiny brass, menacing curve, and those cinematic designs ended up defining what the world still calls a Bowie knife today. Knife makers followed suit, mass-producing versions that matched the movies instead of the messy reality of 19th century craftsmanship. So the Bowies you see on screen or on a store shelf aren't descendants of Jim Bowie's original blade, they're descendants of Hollywood's idealized one. The legend outgrew the man, and the design became a symbol rather than a replica. And that brings us to number 1, the final and biggest myth of all. The idea that this single knife didn't just make a legend, but became one. The myth that the Bowie knife defined the American frontier itself. Number 1, the Bowie knife defined the American frontier. This is the ultimate myth, the crown jewel of the Bowie legend, that this single knife didn't just shape the frontier, but somehow defined it. For 2 centuries, people have called it the knife that built the West, a blade so feared and admired that it supposedly carved America out of wilderness and war. In movies, it's the weapon that wins every duel. In advertising, it became the symbol of frontier toughness. And in popular imagination, it's the single most iconic blade in American history. But the truth is, no knife, not even the Bowie, ever defined the West on its own. The Bowie knife was influential, absolutely. It changed how people thought about personal weapons and how craftsmen designed blades for the next 100 years. But it was only one piece of a much larger frontier story. Rifles fed families and defended homesteads. Revolvers settled gunfights long before knives were drawn. Axes, plows, and railroads did far more to tame the land than any piece of sharpened steel. What the Bowie really conquered wasn't territory. It was imagination. The legend of Jim Bowie, the sandbar fight, and that enormous frontier knife became a story Americans wanted to believe. That one man's courage and one blade's edge could stand for a whole nation's spirit. The phrase, "the knife that built the West," was never history. It was marketing, storytelling, and national myth-making. Knife makers used it to sell steel. Writers used it to sell adventure. Hollywood used it to sell heroism. And over time, the slogan became scripture. So while the Bowie knife may have defined the myth of the West, it didn't build it. What it really forged was a legend, 1 part truth, 2 parts fantasy, and entirely unforgettable. And there you have it, 13 of the biggest myths about the Bowie knife, the blade that legend says built the American frontier. From meteorite steel to Hollywood heroics, we've seen how much of its reputation comes not from history, but from storytelling, craftsmanship, and imagination. The real frontier wasn't shaped by one man or one weapon. It was shaped by thousands. Pioneers, soldiers, hunters, and dreamers, each leaving their mark on a land far more complicated than legend admits. The Bowie knife was their symbol, not their savior. So the next time you see a Bowie knife on screen, remember you're looking at more legend than reality. And maybe that's fine, because the truth behind the myth, the real history, is even sharper. Which of these Bowie knife myths had you believed before this video? And which one surprised you most? Tell me in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the myths and realities of the Wild West, make sure to subscribe for more history that cuts through the legend and gets to the truth. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.